Welcome to Garage Branders, the podcast that dives into the world of omnichannel commerce and highlights the innovators and trailblazers behind the brands driving today's connected retail landscape. Support for Garage Branders is provided by Tandem Tide, a performance marketing and omnichannel commerce firm, helping brands thrive in today's digital marketplace. For more information, visit them at tandemtide.com.
Hey everybody, this is Brandy Alexander from Tandem Tide. Welcome to Garage Branders. I'm also joined today by Julie.
Hi. In my homage to SNL's 50th. Tina and Amy, okay. That's why I'm wearing my Mean Girls hat.
Yeah, I love that.
I know,
and then we're joined today.
Here I am.
We're joined today by Andrew Burchwell from the Ohio Blockchain Alliance, which, you know, I wanted to talk to Andrew because he's a blockchain crypto sort of expert, but he also is a brand founder in that he started his own organization. So Andrew, welcome.
Thanks for having me today. Looking forward to it.
So tell us, just everything that you have going on, how, sort of your origin story, what led you to starting this organization?
Yeah, kind of a long and winding road. It's not intuitive how I ended up here. I started my early career. I was an energy technology professional. I studied geophysics. So I was way up in the mountains and totally different from this sort of digital realm that I work in now. The intersection and where I started from and what it led me to was in energy technology. And so we were looking at how to take novel applications and apply them to energy systems, whether that's oil and gas or renewable infrastructure, things like that. And one of the things that I think people don't necessarily recognize when it comes to cryptocurrency or blockchain technologies is that there is a compute aspect to this behind the scenes, right? So data centers, like we would think of for Microsoft, Google, Amazon, also exist and particularly exist at scale for Bitcoin. We call it Bitcoin mining, which we can talk about there. And because I had a personal interest in Bitcoin, the digital asset technology, and I was noticing around 2020, 2021 that not only was cryptocurrency not something that was diminishing, but it was increasing in public attention and adoption and all of these things. And I felt like it was a very important and pivotal technology to take forward. I just decided to get really interested in applying that from a commercial perspective. And so I started a consulting firm that was focused on developing the Bitcoin mining compute alongside, certain energy systems as really what we saw as a waste reduction effort. There are unique applications to Bitcoin mining that make it interesting from an energy perspective. And what that led to was noticing that, as much as there was a focus on this nationally and globally, the state-based efforts that were happening that we see through other trade associations like OhioX and other really great organizations within Ohio were starting to matriculate for the blockchain industry, but they were in other states, Texas, Wyoming, Florida, et cetera. And there really wasn't anything in Ohio that was working towards this purpose with these technologies. And I just happened to sit in Columbus. I happened to be working in the industry. I had a really good network and was kind of just the person to take this forward. And so we started a trade association nonprofit basically to advocate and educate for these technologies, not only within the business community, but also focused on policy, not only at the state level, but within DC. So I spend a little bit of time in both sort of policy jurisdictions, trying to affect legislation and what we think would be necessary to move these technologies forward. So I do a little bit of all of the above. We host events, networking events, education events, and really what I'm attempting to affect is business development and marketing of the idea to the broader public, but specifically within Ohio, which is a place that I'm from and love very much.
So Andrew, whenever I hear my husband or his friends mention crypto, blockchain, etc., my eyes kind of glaze over. I was going to ask if you could break it down in simple terms, like explain it to a fourth grader, but I actually have a fourth grader and he knows all about this. So what should the average person know or care about when it comes to crypto? Because
yeah, a fair question. I get it all the time. I totally understand. Trust me, I've had many conversations personally where people's eyes glaze over when I'm trying to tell them about all these exciting things that we're working on. It's just part of it.
I'm like, I don't care about whatever that coin is that you purchased.
Meme coins and NFTs, and, what does all this stuff mean?
Yeah.
I would say at its simplest, we're talking about a network technology like the internet, right? So if I'm to abstract it all the way back, and if you were to look at the early internet in the early 1990s and what that looked like compared to what it looks like today, it's actually unfathomable in 1992 to expect that we're doing this podcast here today virtually from random places in the world. We're all on social media, connected with people globally and instantaneously. And so what digital assets, broadly speaking, do is allow that to occur with the internet, but for money and value transference. And so, we've lived in a world of the dollar our entire lives, and it's just kind of the way we think about how we pay for things, what things cost, right? It's how we value pretty much everything within the world. And what things like Bitcoin are doing is saying that we're just going to take that approach that has existed under this other avenue of technology, which, you could think of Visa and MasterCard as another type of network technology where I rely on them to be the thing that processes what I'm paying for and what I get in return. Bitcoin is just doing the same thing. The difference is in its scale, its speed, and its trustlessness nature. So what I mean by that is essentially within the global system of money today, if I am using Visa or MasterCard or Chase Bank or anything within the traditional financial system, I am essentially paying them a certain amount of money every time I make a transaction to affect that transaction. And it could be 1% to 5%, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
We can look at this as, bank fees or credit card fees or interest or all these other things. And we do that because we're relying on those entities to create the trust that when I send my money somewhere, it's going to get to that person. And I can't also send that same money to somebody else twice, right? We call this the double spend problem. And so what Bitcoin allows you to do is do that without a third party. It essentially just settles within the network technology and the software itself. And what that means is that you can do things more efficiently and also actually much faster and at much larger scales. So if I were to send $1 billion overseas today, it probably would take me 3 to 5 days. I'd have to make several phone calls. There'd be all kinds of things to do.
Mm-hmm.
I can do that with Bitcoin today, and it will settle. Final settlement will occur in usually around an hour and at very low cost, right? So I could send $1 billion for tens to hundreds of dollars in fees, essentially. So it's a relatively minor percentage. That's at its very basic. There's a lot behind the scenes that make that work, but that's essentially what it's doing. And so cryptocurrency is essentially the point of what we're doing. Now you can add things on top of that, right? So when we talk about things like, NFTs or smart contracts or things like that, all you're really saying is, well, we're going to take this system of money and we're going to program it to work in different ways and more efficiently and maybe automatically in ways that we can't do with traditional currency. It can get as complex as you want it to be, but I would say start simply, start with the first thing that occurred in the cryptocurrency space, which is Bitcoin, and recognize why is Bitcoin at $100,000 and everything else really pales in comparison to that. I think that's a worthy inquiry for people who are curious. Mm-hmm. The reasons for that are just due to the nature of it as a software, and it at its essence is just a software and a network technology.
That's super interesting. And I have this discussion. I have a 22-year-old son, so he's, heavily invested in cryptocurrency. But, my sort of conversation with him is, well, I get it from the technology standpoint, but what if the US dollar were to be applied to the blockchain and really just replace Bitcoin as the fundamental currency? Is that a thing? Would that work?
Sort of, yeah. I think, tokenized dollars, essentially what we call stable coins today, exist, and they are actually broadly maybe the more useful, what we would call medium of exchange, a value transference technology. And we dollarize those. Essentially one cryptocurrency token in a stablecoin environment equals $1, right? So the metrics are the same. We don't have any confusion about, how much does this cost in another metric, right? And that's actually very valuable today within this digital ecosystem to send value. And the difference between that and Bitcoin and why I think they will eventually work in tandem is exactly what you're saying, which is that it's very hard to say we're going to replace the dollar. That, feasibly, that doesn't make a lot of sense. What people are looking for in anything that they invest in is that this is going to be a good store of value over the short, medium, and long term, right? So if I'm investing in a stock, I'm assuming that that company is going to perform well, and 20 years later, I've made a decent return on my investment, essentially. And from that store of value perspective, this is where Bitcoin really performs extremely well today. It's why we refer to it sometimes as digital gold. And the reason why that is separate from the things that we talk about in dollarized tokens and stablecoins and things like that is that Bitcoin has a firm supply limit. There will never be more than 21 million Bitcoin. And that firm limit is what creates scarcity, which means that it can't be manipulated like in the dollar environment today in just regular US dollars. The Federal Reserve and the federal government can essentially say, we're just going to create more dollars and we're going to put them out into the ecosystem. And what that will tend to lead to is inflation and some other effects that are not necessarily great, but it's to create liquidity within the market environment. You can't do that with Bitcoin, essentially. So it's really the first ever firm asset that you could ever invest in. Even things like gold, which would be the traditional analogy, there's actually no limit to the amount of gold that we could acquire. And we might think that there are technical limits to getting after gold within the earth, but all we have to do is figure out the technology in 20 years to mine a single asteroid, and then we will have added more gold than exists within the current market of gold globally. You can't do that with Bitcoin. It's hard coded and it's enforced that essentially there is a fixed limit. And that is what creates this market competitiveness and what we're seeing now, which is kind of like the FOMO of, well, if there's only so much, then, I'm going to want a piece of this, because as more and more people want it, it's going to become more and more valuable. So, sometimes we'll also, like, real estate or land is another good example. Like, we're not making any more land on earth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there are better places developed than others, but at the end of the day, a fixed asset that is in demand is going to create this return on investment on the long term. And we've already seen that in the 15 years that Bitcoin has existed. And especially over the last 10 years, it's been the best performing asset of any single asset class in the entire world. And it's not even close, actually. So I expect we'll continue to see that, but I also expect that in this digital environment, other types of cryptocurrencies will interact, but Bitcoin will always be at the foundation of that because of its nature and because it's unique compared to all of the other cryptocurrencies.
So is there a concern with Bitcoin investors that, I guess, there's only going to be 21 million, but if there is so much demand, it's digital. So is there a reason that it would just stop at 21 million? I know that's a thing, but.
Yeah, the reason is that is hard coded and enforced by the rule set. And this is where Bitcoin mining comes into play, because the way that the decentralized network technology works, which means there's no central entity, there's no board of governors, there's no company that is Bitcoin. This is purely participatory, open source software. That rule that there are only 21 million Bitcoin is enforced in essence by the global network of computation. And to corrupt that essentially would be so difficult that, even if you were to accomplish it, you would essentially crater the value of Bitcoin by creating more Bitcoin. So it wouldn't be worth your while unless, maybe you just want to see the world burn. But it is so difficult to do. And I think, a lot of that has to do with the nature of the technology itself. But the hardware component of that is really what creates this defensive barrier within a physical realm. And I think that, there's not many scenarios that we played out game theoretically that would lead to that changing. And even if it did, it wouldn't be worth the effort to do so. So we feel pretty comfortable that firm limit will stay.
I just have so many more questions, but I want to ask, how can marketers be thinking about using, blockchain and these technologies into their strategies moving forward?
I think anytime you give people a reason to try something new, they're intrigued by it. So what we've seen, and again, from a marketing perspective, it could be as simple as, like, a good example is somebody that makes wine, a friend of mine that makes a really great brand of wine in Paonia, Colorado. And he's selling this at farmers markets, and he's just doing the regular commerce game. But a few years ago, he started putting a we accept Bitcoin sign on his little farmer stand. And that didn't necessarily mean that people started paying in Bitcoin right away, but it led to all of these conversations about Bitcoin and why would it be valuable for me to pay for this wine in Bitcoin and things like that. And there are good reasons, and there are, reasons that maybe are more philosophical about why you might want to interact with this system. But I think the reason why we're even having this conversation is that you both know that people are asking about this. They're curious. They want to understand what this is about and what does it mean. And I think just opening the door to suggesting we're, as any brand, forward thinking enough to want to incorporate a new technology into our portfolio or platform or commerce or services, that's going to create an attention vector that, you might be surprised by. And I think what you're going to end up doing is capturing the intrigue of a pretty large network of people who are already using cryptocurrency to say, well, if this brand is on board with something that I care about, maybe I should pay more attention to that brand. I would start there. There are other good business reasons why people would want to accept cryptocurrency, the lower fees being a really tremendous one, the ability to instantaneously settle, right? So if I have a traditional payment processor, maybe it's 3 to 5%, and maybe it's a few days until I get that money. Whereas cryptocurrency, I have that money in my account relatively instantaneously in comparison. Those are all good commercial reasons to use it. But I think at the end of the day, why this is so interesting to the world is because of the mimetic potential of it. It's so new. It's so interesting. It's so murky and uncertain, but not necessarily in a bad way. It's just like, what is this really about? And I guarantee you that over the next 2, 3, 4 years, that is going to increase and likely increase exponentially. So I would say just, do it to put yourself ahead of the curve. This isn't going anywhere. This is very likely to be the system of commerce we use for the rest of our lives anyway. And because we're so early, being an early adopter has a tremendous amount of benefit.
I can see that. Absolutely.
So aside from cryptocurrency, I mean, blockchain is its own thing, right? There's a lot of other applications for, blockchain technology beyond just the currency aspect of it. So that's what I'm sort of interested in as somebody who, works with a lot of people on the commerce side. Like, what else should they be thinking about and how to apply blockchain to their business and their strategies?
Sure. And it's important to recognize that, blockchain as an individual technology is part of a suite of technologies that make Bitcoin, for instance, what it is, right? So Bitcoin is built on the blockchain, but it has these other technologies wrapped around it. Blockchain is one aspect of it. And when you talk about, well, what is the blockchain itself? It is, in essence, an immutable ledger, right? So we have databases, we have all of these other programs that we can use to collect and store information. The trick is, how do you ensure that that information is valid and hasn't been corrupted or changed over time, right? So there are all these verification and trust issues that are inherent in, maybe why is this a good tool to problem solve for? So a lot of the things that we hear in terms of attempting to create a digital sort of approach to this trustless environment is a good example is a company based out of Cleveland, actually, called Champ Titles. So it was Bernie Moreno's old company before he got into politics. And so it's now being run as an entity that essentially said, well, what if we put auto titles on the blockchain, right? That was the simple concept. And they did this early enough that it was kind of seen as a crazy idea in, 2016, 2017, essentially. But in doing that, what they created was an efficient way for a government to ensure that the information in record for a specific application, which was auto titles here, could be verified, trusted, auditable, and easily transferable, right? So anytime you buy or sell a car, you transfer title, and that is a process, and it's typically done on paper. And then you can imagine over the years of the volumes of information that can handle and process, that can be very onerous. So they just said, well, let's make this digital. We'll put it on the blockchain so that it can be trusted and verified. And they've been able to successfully sell this to state governments as an example. And so that's one way I think you could look at healthcare records. I think voting is actually a really interesting application for this. And there was actually an example in the 2024 presidential election of a county in Georgia that incorporated a Bitcoin blockchain technology to basically put all voter records time-stamped on this blockchain and on the ledger. And what that means is that it can't be changed. Essentially, once you get past a certain period of time, to go back and change information on old blocks within the blockchain. And you could think of a block as just a package of information in the broader database of the chain. What that means is that you can't have somebody come in and change vote tallies potentially or other things, right? So it creates this time-stamped auditability that is immutable, and immutable just means very, very difficult to corrupt or change. And that allows for a surety within, a voting process that we would all agree we want to see be handled correctly and without fraud and all of these other things. So in the non-commercial or commerce or monetary aspect of these things, I think it's best to think about blockchain from a records keeping perspective. And that can be done on a number of blockchains and in a number of ways. And I think this is where, when we step outside the money aspect of this, you're going to see a lot of experimentation moving forward, just as people try to figure out what to do with this.
That's really interesting. I lots of information there. I want to step back though, because I just started thinking about the mining aspect. So there's a set amount of Bitcoin out there. So Correct. Can you explain the mining? Like, what is that? Why are teenagers doing it? Why are college kids doing it? And then there's like huge, large scale operations of the mining. So what's kind of in store for, what's the plan for Ohio particularly, and what can like just everyday people do also?
Yeah, so like blockchain, the mining and what we call proof of work, which is essentially we can verify through the mining that you've used electricity to perform compute, right? That's the work that's being performed. That process is essentially what creates an ability for the network to secure itself from attack, right? So if I have any other blockchain that has another verification mechanism, there are potential ways through there that have nothing to do with real world physical cost, right? So if I'm a hacker and I'm trying to hack into another cryptocurrency or even just stall it from working, for instance, in a non-proof of work environment, a non-mining environment, that's all software, it's all code, right? So you have this attack vector that is a pretty low physical cost. It just takes a little bit of time and effort and ingenuity to approach. And that is not as defensible as something that requires you to use a tremendous amount of electricity and hardware and infrastructure to effect. And so we look at proof of work Bitcoin mining as a defensive wall against corruption. And the reason why people do it is that you can make money doing that. So the network itself, the software, is coded to incentivize that behavior, which is why we've seen the proliferation of, I think there are, over 30 public traded companies that are mining Bitcoin now. You're seeing a lot of this globally and in places where, maybe energy is a little cheaper because that has something to do with the economics of the system.
Yeah.
But essentially in doing that, you're creating the process whereby the network can uphold the rule set of the code. And in doing the mining, basically you're playing this big random lottery game of winning the right to essentially assemble all transactions, every transaction that occurs within the Bitcoin network, every 10 minutes, and then package and add those transactions to the blockchain. So this is also the way the network processes the information. And the right to do that is based on some advanced cryptography and some random chance, which actually makes it extremely equitable. It means that, one computer essentially equals one computer anywhere in the world, which means that there's no necessarily unfair advantage. It eventually just comes down to how efficient are your computers and how much compute do you have relative to the total network.
Yeah.
And in doing that, if you were to win, quote unquote, the reward of being able to package all transactions and add them to the block, the software of Bitcoin itself, this decentralized open source software, essentially releases new Bitcoin to you as a result and reward of that effort. So this is where the revenue comes in for it, which is that every 10 minutes today, 3.125 Bitcoin are awarded for that process. And so there's this global game.
So as long as your computer is processing it, you're going to cash in a little bit on the Bitcoins that are being shuffled around, right?
Sort of, yeah. Okay. So you can imagine if I have one computer and there are a million computers globally, my one computer may not have a great chance of winning that game. So maybe once every 5 years, I would win that game and get the reward. The reward would be high, but it would be very inconsistent. It's very hard to build a business doing that.
Right.
So what we've ended up doing is creating what we call pools, and pools are essentially just aggregations of compute. So I put my one computer next to 1,000 other computers, and then we all compete together as one unit.
Okay.
Then over time, we're all paid out relative to the amount of compute we've added to the package. And that allows for a smoothing of the revenue model, which is why you can create a business around this, essentially, because I have a more regular return on investment.
Right.
And we know based on certain calculations, how much compute I have is going to equal this payout more or less over time. So that's where you can kind of get the financialization of this to occur. I think that what we're seeing in Ohio, and what our thesis was when we started this effort within the Ohio Blockchain Council, was to say, there are good reasons why Bitcoin miners would want to build these systems in Ohio. We have a lot of legacy infrastructure, right? We have a history of manufacturing here, but a lot of that moved overseas or went out of business. And so a lot of those bones still exist, and they're looking for businesses to come in. But often where there was manufacturing, there isn't necessarily a lot of people or a lot of effort to build and develop new things.
Yeah, we have a lot of, I hate to say this term, but like ghost towns, kind
Right,
of, where
right.
they've just been abandoned.
Yeah, because
and nothing else can go there because of the industry that was there previously.
Exactly. And so what we noticed was that that's actually a perfect place to build Bitcoin mining, because it can use the electrical infrastructure. It doesn't necessarily need a lot of people to perform it. There are plenty of jobs that are ancillary to the development of this hardware in these data centers. But at the end of the day, this is a relatively remote process. And so we call that, it's location agnostic. Google is not going to build a data center in the middle of nowhere, Ohio, but Bitcoin mining can. And that's really great for the local economy. That's really great for the state. And we just anticipated that that would happen more and more. And we've seen that come true. There are several public companies that have announced large facilities in Ohio. I think we're going to continue to see that trend grow. And I think there are reasons why Ohio is going to be really good at this game. And that's why we wanted to champion this industry from Ohio's perspective.
Yeah, super cool.
So, I was going to ask another question on the mining, because I find that really interesting. I saw
Julie's going to start a side hustle, Bitcoin mining now.
We're going to be Bitcoin hustlers. So you said the mines themselves, they don't need a lot of manpower, because they can work 24 hours a day on their own, basically, because it's just computers computing. And I saw a video of people that lived near one, and it made a lot of noise. And to your previous career, with energies and all of that, it does take up a lot of energy. Is Ohio prepared for that kind of lift when it comes to providing the energy needed to do the mining? And then I have another follow-up after that.
Yeah, you have to get really into the nitty-gritty of the grid system and the way that energy is created and transported. And this can get pretty complicated. The answer is sort of. There's a lot of data center growth in Ohio generally, and most of that, 90 to 95% of that, is coming from these hyperscalers, the Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Metas of the world. And where they're building their facilities, we see a lot of this in Licking County, for instance, just east of Columbus. And the reason why is that they need redundancy, they need a really heavy workforce, and they need fiber internet connectivity, right? So they have all these infrastructure requirements that demand that they locate close to city centers. And city centers tend to be where power is most constrained, where there's just less of it available. And so what's unique about Bitcoin mining is that it can go to all of the other pockets of the state where there isn't that demand. And so there's a lot of available power that's not being utilized that we can essentially utilize effectively. And this does a few things. One, it allows us to reinvest in the infrastructure that's more local in these rural parts, right? So when I reinvest in electrical infrastructure from a regional perspective, that's actually to the benefit of the broader ecosystem.
Yeah.
Because Bitcoin mining may not be there forever, but what you leave behind is upgraded infrastructure for something else. I think that's really,
they may be on broadband, but now you've brought in fiber or these other higher speeds. Okay.
Yeah, or high voltage transmission or substation or distribution, things like that. But it's also something where what I think is intriguing about it, and what I noticed was something that we should talk about more, is that this is actually a really great way for us to incentivize developing more energy generation infrastructure. So if we say we're in this power constrained environment, and what we don't want are blackouts or loss of power, or, you know, the inability even for the state to bring in other industries because we don't have power for them. What we need is more power generation. What we need is better energy systems generally, right? Whether you think that's renewables or just more efficient systems. At the end of the day, Bitcoin mining can be a tremendous complement to that because of its nature, and because it can locate anywhere. You can essentially incentivize facilities anywhere, whereas some of the other technologies can't do that. The other aspect of Bitcoin mining that's super interesting, but again, very technically complex, is that it's extremely flexible. So what that means is that I can turn these miners on and off quickly and at any given time. And what that allows is, say there's a winter storm or a really, really hot summer day. Everybody's got their heat on, everybody's got their AC on, the grid gets really constrained. Sometimes we get these warnings like brownout warnings or things like that. And that's because there isn't enough supply to meet the demand. Well, Bitcoin mining is a flexible energy consumer, can essentially say, well, in those times of peak demand, we'll turn all our computers off and push that power we would be using back to the broader grid to make it available for people in their homes and things like that. So that's actually really beneficial to the utilities, to the grid itself. And that creates actually an ability for us to essentially maximize the efficiency of the system at any given time. Because otherwise, you're going to have excess generation when there's no demand. And then that's actually a really hard business model for these power companies, right? The nuclear facilities in Ohio, that we have 2 of them, were underutilized to a point where there was a consideration that maybe we should just close these off. Maybe we should just shut these down because we're not able to sell enough of our power. Well, Bitcoin mining comes in and it says, we'll buy your power when it's available. And when you need it for other things, we'll give it back to you. And there's sort of a mutual benefit that occurs there. So broadly speaking, I see Bitcoin mining not as an energy like hog, not as something that is problematic from its consumption, but actually its consumption is creating these downstream effects that I think are really net positive to the broader ecosystem.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think this is like getting really technical, but in a really, kind of fascinating way. How were you, I know you talked about your organization, like tell us how the organization is doing. What's next for that?
Yeah, it's been a really great year essentially for Bitcoin policy and for digital asset policy, right? So the winds have certainly shifted. We're in a much better place than we were in 2022. So things are exciting now. Everybody wants to talk about this. People are looking to affect this positively, not only within the state, but nationally, right? So we want to become a leader in innovation in these technologies. So for us, it's just continuing to be participating in that effort. There are several bills within the Ohio House and Senate that are focused on these technologies now. So a lot of our work is going to be educating around the topic to ensure that these bills make sense and that they get passed and that Ohio becomes a leader in these technologies. But a lot of what I do too is trying to go to the broader network of industry and say, hey, Ohio is a really great place to come headquarter or do business or build your systems. So it's really kind of being that independent economic development arm for a specific industry and to champion Ohio to continue to develop these things within the state. We host an event yearly. We call it Amplify. We've done it for 3 years. And that really is a great way for us to just kind of bring like-minded people together who are development focused and really, speak about these topics and get people in the room and network. And I know you guys know what benefit that can be just to have people in the room in space talking to each other. And so we're just going to do more things like that. We're going to have, legislative education days. We're going to have networking opportunities and things like that. But hopefully also in the next year, we see policy get passed that will create an environment where Ohio can say, yeah, we're at the forefront of these technologies. We want to be a leader. And so a lot of my work is just continuing to show up and educate and do these things to move that forward.
That's awesome. So where can everyone find you?
So our website is ohioblockchain.org. You can find me at Andrew Burchwell on Twitter. I don't necessarily talk a lot about Bitcoin and blockchain on Twitter, but sorry, we don't even call it Twitter anymore. That's how things came through. And then, LinkedIn is a great place to connect with me if you want to, set up a meeting or learn more or get connected with me. I'm always happy to talk to people about this topic.
And when is your event? Is that coming up in the fall?
Yeah, we don't have a date hard scheduled yet. Typically it's late September, early October. And, I like to do it when the weather's still pretty decent here in Ohio.
Right.
Get a nice day in Columbus. So yeah, we'll look to do it around that time again this year.
Awesome. I love that. My final question is, who else should we be talking to? I like to ask that at the end. So you refer us to someone else that has something to say about either being a brand founder or a brand innovator.
Well, I think one of the best branders that I know is a guy named Patrick Klein. He runs a social club here in Columbus, and he's also running a VC and does a lot of things for the community. And so he's somebody that I really look to as a champion, not only for Columbus, but just for affecting the business community and getting brands out there in general. So happy to connect you guys as well. And I think we'll have a good conversation. So
I love that. Sounds good.
And Andrew, I have one last question.
Yeah, do it.
Are Jack Dorsey and Satoshi the same person?
I have to say, this happens all the time where people will come out and say, I've solved it. We figured it out. We know who this is.
I mean, I'm going to send you on LinkedIn the last thread I was on, just following it. And I will say, diving into his sailing history. And there's I'm sure you've seen it. But
I will say, I'm always laughing at the attempts that are made to try to identify Satoshi. There's actually tremendous value in not knowing who it is.
Right.
Oh, it's like Banksy, like the
But I will say the theory around Jack Dorsey maybe is the most interesting I've seen to date. I'll put it that way.
I agree with you 1,000%. I think that is just the mystery man.
It's fun. It's fun to think about. Yeah. I think it's to our benefit that we don't know who it is, and hopefully we never do, but it's fun to talk about.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. We appreciate it.
Thank you both. This was great.
Thanks.
Awesome.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Welcome to Garage Branders, the podcast that dives into the world of omnichannel commerce and highlights the innovators and trailblazers behind the brands driving today's connected retail landscape. Support for Garage Branders is provided by Tandem Tide, a performance marketing and omnichannel commerce firm, helping brands thrive in today's digital marketplace. For more information, visit them at tandemtide.com.